Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Napoleon Q&A series, the first of at least several episodes I think we'll do over the rest of the Napoleon series. The idea with these is that it can be shorter form content I can make in the interim between the main episodes. Yeah, I think I got about 30-40 questions from the post, the pinned comment, also emailed to me, so yeah, plenty to go through. But yeah, without further ado, we'll get straight into it. So question 1. Napoleon the Great asks, who was Napoleon's true best friend? Human Body Maintenance says Jean Lannes. Elegy says Louis de Say. Both are good answers. Honestly, it's hard to say if Napoleon ever had any true friends. He certainly had people he was affectionate towards, like de Say and Lannes, but that didn't stop him from turning their deaths to political advantage. We could also add Eugène Beauharnais and Marat, but they were family, though not by blood. Agathon Fin, Jean Rapp, Jacques Lauriston, Anne-Marie Savary. There were a couple of aides and secretaries and personal assistants, people like that, who Napoleon definitely liked. Louis Bourrienne claimed that they were schoolmates, they were best mates in school, but these were claims made years later in his memoirs, so it's a little bit debatable, especially considering Bourrienne's conduct. There's an extended list of people who Napoleon got along with, which would include most of his secretaries over the years, a few of his memoirists from Elba and St. Helena, mostly St. Helena. The pattern in a lot of this is that Napoleon had few, if any, real relations with people who were his peers or equals. Most of the people he liked are young men who he probably singled out mostly because they were, genuinely talented or interesting, or he spotted something in them, and then he felt like he could mentor them and sculpt them afterwards. So that definitely describes his relationship with Eugène, definitely as well most of his younger ADCs like Sebastiani. So ultimately, it's probably not very satisfying to say that Napoleon had no true friends, excepting maybe Lannes, who's pretty unique in that he was about the same age and he'd been a consistent part of Napoleon's life going back to the early 1790s. So when we get to Lannes' death, we'll look at the letter to his wife, which is definitely one of the heartfelt letters that Napoleon wrote. All right, second question now. Elegy asks if Napoleon really wrote those letters to Josephine asking her not to bathe, among other things. The answer is maybe. The specific reference I used for that tidbit, and I think it was probably episodes 5 or 6, maybe 7, is on page 82 of the Andrew Roberts biography of Napoleon. The actual letter he's referring to wasn't actually sent until Napoleon was returning from Rastatt in November, or December maybe, of 1797. And unfortunately, though I've got most of Napoleon's letters, I can't actually find that specific letter, but it is referenced by research from Jean Toulard, who's the sort of the Napoleonic goat, if you will, the French Napoleonic goat. So its veracity is definitely debatable. I probably shouldn't have included it, but I didn't really look too hard at the time. But that being said, I can definitely confirm there's dirty stuff and also just, more nice sort of husband-wife stuff in the letters anyway. It's also worth noting that Hortense, who was the one she didn't receive the letters, obviously, Josephine received the letters, but Hortense, when Josephine died in 1814, Hortense took most of her letters and then collated them, mostly for, personal records, also for kind of, publication later on. But she did edit some of those letters, omit some of them, omit some phrases from them, just neaten them up. Basically. So it's possible that particular phrase or that particular letter just never saw the light of day, or it probably did, but again, was somewhat censored. It's worth saying that Josephine had a very particular daily routine where she would wash and bathe in the morning every day. So you'll see that in a lot of Napoleon's letters, he says he'll return home very suddenly. So in that context, not to bathe could actually be interpreted more like, I'll be home suddenly, so factor me into your day or build your daily schedule around me, because I'll just, I'm going to dominate your day, basically. But yeah, however you personally interpret it, it's undoubtedly the case that Napoleon was sexually expressive to Josephine in their correspondence. So among other things, Napoleon made a lot of references to cunnilingus, using euphemisms like Oscar, Moina, famously the Baron Keppen, petite cousine, like little cousin. For instance, there's a letter from April of 1796 which has the phrase un baiser plus bas que le cœur, which is a kiss a little lower than the heart. So, no points for guessing what that was referring to. But I'll put in a couple more examples where it's it's never explicit, but it is there. But yeah, in terms of the propaganda value of any of this, people were kind of prudish back then, but the French were definitely sort of very sexual people back then. I think I mentioned it that there was a lot of, sleeping around and cuckoldry in the higher ranks of the political society and certainly among the generals and things like that. At a certain point, it did more damage to your career to not be sexually promiscuous than it did to actually be, pretty like a straight arrow. So the play for any of these letters read, certainly nowadays no one really cares, but, read throughout the 19th century, read through some parts of the 20th century, they could, technically be used to paint Napoleon in a bad light, but I think there's a lot of pathos in it. There's a lot of, there's more earnestness in a letter that expresses, wanting to arrive at your wife's home suddenly and have her just, focus on you than there is in any number of whitewashed, letters or poems, anything back home from people who knew that they would be read in posterity and wanted to sort of self-censor like that. I mean, these are letters written from a man who was very lonely, quite young as well. Let's not forget. Most of these are from the Italian campaign. Very young, very lonely, very much infatuated with a woman who's not infatuated with him. Like he's sort of bearing his heart on his sleeve for her. But yeah, if you want to read any of these letters, I'll put the links in the description. So question 3, Enlo asks about the time frame and scope of Napoleon's empire. So Napoleon had a vision of empire he called the Grand Empire, which was basically exactly what existed from 1804 to 1813, we'll call it. So a system of client states ruled by client rulers, and those client rulers were almost always meant to be members of Napoleon's family or his inner circle. So given that it's a very short time frame and the massive radical changes in the political and national boundaries of Europe, it might seem Napoleon went too far too fast. You could argue that, and certainly was a major part of the coalition's rhetoric against Napoleon as a conqueror, and why, as you point out, Talleyrand soured on Napoleon, as he did. But from another point of view, Europe had been experiencing really big geopolitical shifts in the decades before Napoleon, like with the partitions of Poland, then the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Wars, all of which redrew a lot of European borders and boundaries. And also, the collapse of the Etcherie is pretty big here because it basically turned Germany into kind of like free real estate for a couple of years there. So Napoleon didn't respect much of the extant spheres of influence of European powers, but he did respect the concept. He was basically trying to make new ones, and obviously a big one for France that would benefit France. So we see from 1797 to 1804, he could tolerate independent powers like Prussia, Austria, Russia, if they were constrained and had clearly delineated spheres of influence. But yeah, the continental system is what really upturns that, because at that point, no state in Europe can actually be fully independent, because Napoleon needs every bit of coastline to be part of the blockade and every nation to be part of the blockade for it to be effective. That's also partly why he couldn't just stay home after 1804. He couldn't just, okay, I've got, France has got Italy, France has got Switzerland, basically West Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Western Europe, we'll call it, minus Britain. We've got all that. Let's just, call it quits and let Austria have Austria's sphere, Prussia have Prussia's sphere. Couldn't really do that because you kind of needed to get involved at the very least in their economic policy, if not outright, domestic policy. Like you'd probably say that Napoleon's own domestic policy in France was tied up to the success of his foreign policy. Question 4, another from Enlo. He asks why Napoleon didn't develop Louisiana. Well, the answer is that he tried as consul. Much of the underlying logic of the Haitian reconquest was to eventually revitalize Louisiana and use it as a base for a French Caribbean empire, basically. But even after Louisiana was sold, Napoleon actually only fully gave up on his American dream in 1812, 1813, when it was just impossible to do. Practically, it was impossible a lot earlier than that. You'd say like 1808, 1809. But yeah, it was part of his foreign policy for a while. He had a Western Hemispheric policy for a long while there. Could he have ever allied with the Americans? No. Strictly speaking, yes, he literally could have in some old history, but Napoleon didn't particularly want a partner in the Americas, and he thought the French had all the resources they needed to do it themselves, or to gain their empire in the West themselves. So generally, he was pretty dismissive of America's military capabilities and didn't think they'd be useful as an ally, but he also didn't think they'd be particularly tough as an enemy. So if worse came to worse, he could fight them. As you know, of course, the French and the Americans were fighting on the high seas, quasi-war, as it's called. There were no direct engagements of troops, and there was no serious plans for invasions or anything like that. But yeah, for Napoleon, the United States just doesn't factor into his plans in any real way. Question 5 now from Enlo again. They ask, should Napoleon be remembered as a reformer, primarily as a reformer? So yeah, Napoleon is of course primarily remembered as a general and then as an emperor, and is most famous for his military exploits. And certainly he considered himself first and foremost to be a soldier, something he was very proud of, something he was good at too. He would never have liked to have just been considered the guy who made some successful reforms and then hung up his coat, was, a good statesman. A lot of this ties into Napoleon's views on himself and where he fit into history. He was aware that he was a world historical figure. And he consciously, as we saw a lot, especially in the early episodes, when he's a young man, he's looking for people to emulate. He's consciously modeling some of his decisions, some of his policies, some of his literally aesthetics and the way he does things, the way he does politics on usually ancient political figures, ancient military figures. So he's aware that he has to be more than just the guy that does a couple of reforms. But yeah, if you do have anything more than a cursory knowledge of Napoleon, he's so much more than just a general. He's an administrator, a statesman, and a reformer of exceptional talent. So really, we would have to say he's both a soldier and a statesman. And history is full of lots of people, lots of figures who would be famous in either category on their own. So, top of my head, like Caesar, Cromwell, Augustus, Washington, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, Charlemagne, a couple of the Byzantine emperors like Basil, Justinian, Roman emperors too, Trajan, Vespasian, plenty more I can't think off the top of my head, but people who had very extensive reformist legacies as well as military ones. They maybe not necessarily personally, like Augustus he was personally leading armies, but he wasn't doing the fighting. But people who have a domestic legacy and a military legacy that in either category they would be justly famous for. But yeah, should Napoleon be remembered primarily for his civil achievements? I think so. That's certainly one of the underlying themes, justifications I have for this channel. I'm a lot more interested in his, exactly what you see, domestic policy, his economic policy, his reforms, than I really actually am in his military career. But battles and wars are, sexy and cool, so that's what people are primarily remembered for. Question 6, Mads PGR asked if I have any what-if questions about Napoleon. So I probably have the same ones as most people's, like, what if there's no Spain, no 1812 campaign, no Egypt? What if Napoleon accepts the Frankfurt Convention, the Frankfurt Compromise? There are also some weird ones out there, like what if Napoleon escaped to South America after St. Helena and somehow ended up in a position of power there? That was a real possibility. There was I can't remember where it was, and it was kind of a fleeting hope because he died by the time any representatives were going to be sent over. But I think it was probably the Gran Colombia that wanted to send representatives over because there was power struggles in all of the post-independence South American states. But the idea was basically get Napoleon over there, give him an army, give him control of the country, and then just see what he can do. Basically, it wasn't a mature idea at all, but it's certainly an interesting what if, I guess, if it's possible. We've got another one from Enlo, question 7. He's asking about the specifics of accepting the Frankfurt proposals. So the way I see it, you've got two big possibilities. The first and most likely is that the coalition offers terms, Napoleon accepts, and there's peace for a little while, and then the coalition reneges. So Napoleon is simply too much of a potential threat for them to leave in power. He is also seen in the courts of Europe as an aberration and unfit to be a ruler, and literally almost like blood-wise unfit to be a monarch. So going beyond sheer political and strategic military necessity, there's an aspect of honour and prestige at play. But the main point would at least be to disarm France, and there's no way that Napoleon accepts like a 100,000 strong army or something like that. Basically, the only possible guarantees the coalition would accept post-Frankfurt would be a disarmed France in exchange for Napoleon staying on the throne. however unlikely. The second possibility is that for whatever reason, Napoleon is left to his own devices, and he in turn then abides by the compromise and doesn't rearm or go back to war. So he still would die in 1821. That's just the way it is. Napoleon II is like 10 or 11 or something like that at that stage, so he would succeed, but under a regent. Does he still die young? What does that do to the empire? Who's the pick for the regent? We could get into all sorts of what-ifs about what Napoleonic France looks like post-Napoleon at that stage. Like, what happens to all the disenfranchised imperial dukes and princes? Like, they've been booted out of their lands in Italy and Croatia and Germany and Poland. What happens to the army? It's now, reduced in size and probably pretty bitter. How does France reintegrate with Europe? How does it normalize relations? How does it go back about normal trade? But I think the main thing here is that, does Bonapartism as a political force survive? So Bonapartism isn't really formalized until long after Napoleon I's death, and basically it's mostly during the reign of Napoleon III. And he doesn't really revive it so much as he constructs it and builds it. But in the context of an empire that somehow survives after 1815, and probably also continuous Bonaparte succession, is Bonapartism a much more fleshed out political force? Is it tempered, less militaristic? Does it emphasize reform? Does it emphasize stability over sort of outright martial glory? That's also presuming that there's no revolutions in the decades after Napoleon's death, which, given the state of France in our own timeline, and this one, I would imagine there would have to be. So any Napoleonic constitutions would have to be revised, updated. They couldn't be anywhere near as authoritarian. Question 8, Adal Shadav asks for an assessment of Marshal Davout. So I'm no military historian, so I'll defer to the judgment of Napoleon here. He was generally appreciative of Davout as one of the more reliable corps commanders. Auerstedt was particularly good for their relations because Napoleon, at least initially, didn't believe the reports that Davout had been engaged by Brunswick's main force. But when he did realize the scale of Davout's victory and his own misjudgment, Napoleon saw how bad it could have been and praised Davout pretty heavily, and it was an earnest praise. As for his conduct in 1812, Davout's failure to ensnare Bagration was a combination of factors. They had really heavy wagon convoys that were over-provisioned, arguably. It was heavy rain, the roads were really bad, and the orders from Napoleon were quite confused, which led to a lot of scrambling of units sent forward rapidly to catch the enemy, when he'd expected them to behave more predictably and stand their ground and fight. But the actual blame for Davout not catching him falls on Jérôme and Eugène. They were not the right picks to lead. Well, they weren't even corps, they were like double corps, like reinforced corps, and they were massive forces for very inexperienced and in the case of Jérôme, irresponsible people to be leading. So Davout received very little help from either and actually took command of a lot of their units when they failed to move and follow orders, but we'll cover all of that in detail when we get to it. Later during the retreat, Davout was blamed for abandoning Ney. Certainly Napoleon and Davout had actually been beefing in the weeks leading up to the retreat, but the actual trigger for Davout, quote-unquote, abandoning Ney was the failure to deliver an order to Ney demanding he abandon Smolensk. So instead, Ney held at Smolensk for a couple of days as per his initial orders, and that's what led to that big breach opening up between Ney and Davout's corps. So Davout could probably have done something to help Ney. Ney certainly said as much, and they were not on good terms after this, to say the least. But under the circumstances, Davout's job was to protect his corps, and Ney pretty much looked like he was a lost cause. The 1813 campaign in Germany is also pretty positive for Davout under the circumstances. The whole campaign is basically just a disaster for the French, and everything is breaking down. So to keep a rump of his force moving and fighting, even if it does ultimately end in disaster, is pretty remarkable. So David Chandler is the military historian I go to for most of the military history stuff on the channel, and he doesn't single out Davout for any real blame in any of this. He's of the opinion that the corps commanders in general, or certainly after about 1808, starting with the Spanish campaign, they were overburdened and overworked by their responsibilities and not given enough independence or latitude to act as they saw fit. Remember, Napoleon is a micromanager. He doesn't want any of his commanders to act, at the very least, without instructions, if not explicit orders. He can be pleasantly surprised, like at Auerstedt, when they do something on their own and it works, but that's not the way he expects them to operate normally. And Davout is one of the more aggressive of the corps commanders and wants to make a lot of, like in Russia, he wants to make a lot of actually flanking maneuvers. He wants to attack generally, but he doesn't get permission. There's a couple of times where if Davout's proposals had been followed, it probably wouldn't have saved the campaign, but it would have at least put them in a different position. He wanted to leave Moscow weeks before they actually did historically. So there's a couple of situations where Davout definitely comes out looking like he's one of the more strategically minded of the corps commanders, which is something that, guys like Ney and Murat, excellent battlefield commanders, excellent tacticians, but their strategy was generally lacking. Davout seems like he was more of an all-rounder, and good at it too. Question 9 now. Rex Lapis asked who had the worst infantry of the Napoleonic Wars. The answer is maybe not so simple as saying one nation or another. All the armies of the period had really good regiments and really poor regiments, and that even goes for some of the minor nations. So the answer depends on where you're looking. Is it just the major belligerents? It also depends on what is meant by the worst. Like, do you mean the worst disciplined, the worst performing, the worst equipped? Like, the French had plenty of really bad regiments, the worst being those provisional regiments sent to Spain, and also raw conscript battalions sent to reinforce regular regiments that then made up the corps facing Austria in 1808 and 1809. They also had, most of the regiments were pretty depleted by 1813 and 1814, so I won't say they were bad so much as they were just, exhausted. But back in 1808 and 1809, that's when Napoleon was aware that his regiments were suffering. That's when he started to put light artillery, like 4-pounders, into regular regiments, which was a little experiment that ended up failing. And then for I think in 1808, he did expand the size of most of his regiments, and then for 1812, he reorganized them again. So he was aware that his regiments did need bucking up, they did need reform and reorganization. Overall, worst infantry, Naples. The Neapolitan army was just crap. But if I had to give an answer for one of the major belligerent nations, it'd have to be the Spanish. Infantry are the backbone of an army, and the Spanish infantry were just wet paper at some battles. But that's not to say that they were actually bad infantry. They were just, generally speaking, poorly led, and they didn't get a lot of the time to recoup or reorganize, like, for instance, the Austrians did. Also, a lot of the Spanish regulars were basically gone after, 1809. Like, when Napoleon comes down after Somosierra, there's very few Spanish regulars that are still able to be put to the field. So most of their infantry after that point is levies. Before then, it had been a combination of regulars and volunteers. But yeah, they never succeeded in turning the levy regiments into anything more than just sort of guys who were present on a battlefield, but they paled in comparison to even fairly weak French regiments. But yeah, I don't want to make this sound like it's some sort of there's a lot of temptation to be like the fighting spirit. It's nothing to do with that. It's just money. It's always money. The Spanish juntas, in this case the Seville junta, just didn't ever really have enough money, and even where they did have money, they didn't give a lot of it over to the army, or at least as much of it as they should have. So the army was never able to rebuild regular regiments. Compare that to the Portuguese, who did, obviously with a lot of British support, but the Portuguese had both the reprieve to rebuild, and they also had the money and funds which were released by their own government, and then most of the money was and supplies as well were supplied by the British government. Question 10, Sardan Dathrahan asks where the German troops were. I don't know what to tell you. They're there. We've mentioned a fair few German origin units like Vrede's Bavarian Division in 1806, several Saxon divisions in Poland, Westphalian divisions in Spain. We'll be seeing a lot more in 1812. Like, famously, half of Le Grand Armée were not French, and the Germans composed, getting on for a third of the 300,000 or so non-French divisions. There's also Schwarzenberg's Austrians and some Prussian units in the initial invasion, if you want to count them. And then survivors of the 1812 campaign will make appearances in battles waged against the French in 1813, as most of the German units defect or desert. But yeah, why you're not seeing them a lot of the time in massive battles is that Napoleon intended for the German units not so much to be frontline infantry, but rather for garrisons, escorts, guards, that sort of thing. The idea was to free up the better French divisions and regiments from occupation duty so that they could actually do some fighting and maneuver in his corps and armies. But yeah, the German units are there, mostly in the background, mostly sort of secondary roles, but they're definitely there. Question 11, Endo asks, where is the apex of Napoleonic battle tactics? The consensus is 1807 and the Polish campaign. It's where the tried and true method of the manœuvre sur le derrière is at its apex, and where the French are best at coordinating their infantry, cavalry, and artillery. It also helps that they have really, really good officers and really, really good experienced regiments and troops at this stage, so they're capable of pulling off pretty complex maneuvers consistently. Doesn't mean that there aren't upsets, doesn't mean that they don't have failures, but they're generally a very formidable force in 1807. But it's not really accurate to say that comparatively worse performance from like 1808 onwards is the result of a decline in the tactical abilities. The decline of French performance is at least as much down to a denuding in quality of the combat arms due to like overconscription, undersupply, because at this stage the Napoleonic Empire is bloody massive. But it's also got a lot to do with the improvements in organization, tactics, abilities of the coalition armies. They learned a lot of the lessons the hard way, fighting the French or from armies that had been defeated by the French. So armies like the Austrian army, the Prussian army especially, had major reforms. So that definitely meant that when they went up against the French, again, they were much better. And then the French army, by comparison, had slightly diminished, but only not as much as is often believed. But yeah, if you want to look into more detail about Napoleonic battle tactics, not only of Napoleon's armies, but also the armies of the coalition, John Elting's Swords Around a Throne is your best bet. And also Battle Tactics of Napoleon and His Enemies by Brent Nosworthy. There's also, of course, David Chandler, the classic. Question 12 now. A couple of you asked about which figures from the Napoleonic era I would have most liked to meet. The two that immediately spring to mind are Talleyrand and Metternich. You'd be able to have some very interesting and insightful conversations with those two. You'd also be well fed, especially with Talleyrand. He was famously kind of lazy, corpulent, liked a good meal, basically. I actually think Lucien or Joseph would probably be good to meet. Both were smart guys that in different times might have been moderately successful in their own right. Lucien especially because he rejected Napoleon, which was not easy to do. So it'd be interesting to see sort of like the character that was able to reject Napoleon. Eugène Beauharnais as well. He was a smart guy, another well-liked guy, often saddled with some pretty tough jobs, and was kind of like a mini Napoleon in a lot of ways. Like he was also did the reformer general thing. So he might be interesting to speak to. Robert Wellesley would also be interesting, if only because he would offer a good British perspective. There was a time there as well where he was a bit of an outsider. He was just an MP, so he wasn't in government. But it'd be interesting to sort of see his perspective on things, especially considering he'd been posted in India for like 6 or 7 years. So he had a wealth of experience outside of Europe. But really, you couldn't go wrong with any like government minister or diplomat or some high-ranking official. Even a couple of the generals from the era. Like, it'd be interesting to talk to, the Duke of Brunswick. He'd probably be a bit of an aristocratic boob, but it'd at least be interesting to talk to. A couple of the kings would not be interesting to talk to. Total opposite of the question. But, I wouldn't want to talk with King Frederick. I wouldn't want to talk with King Carlos. I wouldn't want to talk with any of the Italian rulers. I wouldn't really want to talk with Emperor Francis. Alexander might be interesting. He spoke French. All the Russians spoke French, so he might be interesting. Question 13. We've got a question on the influence of the Napoleonic Wars on independence movements around the world, specifically in South America. The links between what happened in Europe and what happened in South America obviously runs through the nexus of Spain, which from 1808 to 1813 is just continuously occupied and in a very nasty war. So this means that a lot of the early phases of the early wars of Spanish-American independence don't face the kind of military resistance that would have arisen from a Spanish empire that was intact, like weak still, but intact. So as soon as the Spanish can, they organize expeditions to pacify their colonies, but the fallout from the war against the French leaves Spain very weak, very destitute. They don't really recover, actually. Like they never regain the military resources to actually mount successful military expeditions to pacify their colonies, their ex-colonies. Like famously, they have an army revolt in I want to say like 1820 or 1821 against actually going to fight in South America. And that ends Spain's ability to interfere with what by then is a done deal. More specifically on the Napoleonic Wars political influence, if we're going to go with that, there's almost like a negative influence actually. Simon Bolivar was in France during Napoleon's coronation, so he actually witnessed it. And if the apocryphal story is to be believed, he shuttered his windows and refused to listen to any of the celebrations. He didn't like Napoleon's rejection of republicanism, but he had very complicated thoughts on who should wield power, political constitutions, and certainly these were informed by the examples of what was going on in Europe. But as for other independence movements around the world, outside of Central America and South America, we won't touch on them, and I don't really know much about them. I'm trying to think of them, and really the only ones I could think of that you could classify as independence movements would have to be like the Anglo-Mysore Wars, like just India. Because the French had supported a lot of states in India which had resisted the British, sent advisors, sent troops, sent small numbers of troops, sent guns, their naval vessels operated off their coasts, things like that. But it's not a huge part of the Napoleonic Wars at all, and how much what was happening in Europe influenced it is pretty limited. Question 14, Moriarty Holmes asks about Caulaincourt's memoir and how reliable his accounts are. So 100% Caulaincourt was self-serving in his memoirs, but who isn't? That said, it is undeniable he counseled against war against Russia and used whatever insights he'd gleaned as ambassador to St. Petersburg to justify that argument. A couple of Napoleon's ministers like Davout, Champagny, Doucet were against the war. Actually, Champagny got fired for it. I've read parts of Caulaincourt's memoir, mostly when they become relevant. If taken at face value, he wanted to exculpate himself of some of the guilt he felt about the way things turned out and his part in them. Like it reads like a man trying to justify his decisions, like all memoirs, but at the same time, he's not actually. A lot of the time, he doesn't he stands by his decisions, and a big thing as well, he paints Napoleon in a fairly positive light, and he stands by a lot of the decisions Napoleon made and he made with Napoleon as well. But he definitely also leans. It is kind of pro-Napoleonic, at least. He leans into a lot of the Napoleonic tropes, if you will. As for the veracity of a lot of it, it's on the long list of memoirs from the post-Napoleonic era where French generals, ministers, politicians were all publishing their recollections. I'm inclined to believe a little bit more of what I see in Caulaincourt because where he's critical of Napoleon, he's not dismissive. Like, it doesn't really read like he's trying to put political distance between himself and the empire so that he can get, office under the restored Bourbon France. It just reads like a guy who's trying to explain what happened and why he did what he did, with his own biases, of course. But yeah, you can find a copy online, which is what I've got. So if anyone wants that, I guess I can email it to them. I could try and find the link to it as well. Question 15, Pratik Dash asks about cultural biases seeping into Napoleon biographies. Very good question, yes. Absolutely, this is a major concern of mine and something I've noticed as well. So this is going to be a little bit subjective on my part, so take this all with a grain of salt. But my opinion is that in English language histories of the Napoleonic era, you have mostly 19th century and early 20th century history from English historians, English specifically, not like Scottish, Irish, really anyone else. It's like English historians who have a vested interest in defending Britain's conduct because it in turn justifies later imperialism, later wars, later conduct in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's not whitewashing at all, and the histories are good academically. Like, they're good sources still, well researched. They generally speaking go to like they all speak French, so they all go to French sources as well. But they do have a very strong pro-English bias, which is where I'd say like 90% of all Napoleonic troops originate from. And I don't mean like obviously disprovable lies or contemporary propaganda, like Napoleon being a midget. They're just not true. But I mean more in terms of the pervasive myths that keep popping up around Napoleon specifically, but the Napoleonic Wars more generally. For instance, in English histories, you have the turning point in the Napoleonic Wars as the Peninsular Campaign. And if you have an interest in saying that British arms were superior to French arms because you're working in a post-Waterloo context where they won that battle, that's like the prevailing attitude, then you can get away with saying the Peninsular War was the decisive campaign that broke the back of the French Empire. There's also a lot of sort of Angloisms that mostly are about the armies and navies that I see regurgitated and which pop out all the time in media and pop history. Like things like Wellington using reverse slopes. He did, but it's not like he figured it out and he wasn't the only one to do it. Napoleon placed his troops in a reverse slope at Austerlitz, which it did it in exactly the same way Wellington did. You've also got British troops having the perfect linear tactics to counter French columnar tactics. That's a big one. That's a massive one. They were both two parts of the same coin. Everybody used linear and columnar tactics. I will have to detail this at some stage. But the French absolutely had a preference for columnar tactics. The British probably also had a preference for linear tactics, but that doesn't mean that they were used exclusively, and that also, in turn, British linear tactics were like this perfect counter. I see that pop up everywhere. And it also rests on this thing of like, probably the result of Sharp and Bernard Cornwell's novels. Not his fault, but, the 2-3 shots a minute sort of thing. Not a myth, but everybody was trained to fire 2 to 3 shots a minute. It also we're off track now, but this kind of ties into the effectiveness of musket fire, which pretty consistently throughout the time period was proven to be less effective than, at the very least, hoped for, if not outright expected. Like, I've got a couple of... The Prussians conducted some experiments, so they basically just held up a bed sheet and got a company or something to fire into it. And they were interested in the accuracy and if they slowed down the rate of fire, if they improved the accuracy. And they just found that, generally speaking, you need to fire more to get any kind of accuracy. And that's where columnar tactics come in, because it's basically more ammo efficient. It uses less ammunition, which is, if you're fighting multiple battles over, or multiple engagements in one battle over like a couple hours or a day or 2 days, it's really important to conserve ammunition. But yeah, back on topic now. Waterloo. Waterloo is also a bit of a litmus test here, because it's very integral to modern British national identity. Same as Trafalgar, same as Agincourt. Like lots of battles. Hastings, I mean, it's not against the French, so it's an exception, weirdly. But the British definitely put a lot of stock in Waterloo happening a certain way. And most of the depictions you'll see of Waterloo come from the British perspective. They have that bias. So modern English histories are generally much better, and they have taken on the wealth of French sources, also German sources, like Austrian, Prussian sources from German archives, Austrian archives. And all of this improves their usability massively. So I use Robert's biography as the baseline because it is the most modern, it's in my language, I like the structure, and I've read over the years most English language Napoleon biographies I could get my hands on. Though it's uncredited in my sources, Adam Zamoyski's biography is definitely the basis of like my internalized Napoleon criticisms. As for other countries, my general take is that most are much more measured about Napoleon, and some are outright positive. Like plenty of Italian, German, Polish, Russian histories are positive, less so the Italians, and as you'd imagine, the Spanish aren't fans. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to reliability for me. I'm aware the bias is there, so how usable is the actual information within the source. Americans, and to a lesser extent, the very few Australian and Canadian authors, they're also quite good, even if they, by necessity, crib from the English a lot. American histories would have to be the best English language ones overall, and on balance, because they really go to the sources and aren't mined in anywhere near as much national myth making. Like, it's just not essential for their anything to do with their political identity that Napoleon is one way or another. But for the absolute best, you kind of really do have to go to the French. Like, they took it as a serious academic field pretty early on. I want to say in like the 50s. Jean Tudor is the go-to for this. The French also have the benefit of access to, or earlier access to all of the archives, all of the information, And a lot of it has been actually digitally preserved. That's why I can access it. So all of that is so useful. And they're also the ones who largely transcribed and preserved these things. Most of the French histories are modern in the way that they were made in like the last 50 or 60 years, and so incorporate the most up-to-date techniques, up-to-date information. They've got a wider range of sources. Like for instance, a lot of the Imperial Russian documents weren't available for a long while, but they were made available like in the late stages of the Soviet Union and then later by Russia. But yeah, all of this I have complex thoughts on, and it is very complex. I intend to do at least one episode fully on Napoleonic historiography. I'm very much of the opinion that historiography is at least as important as actual history, if not arguably more important. How history played out is not super relevant to people's modern lived experience, but the way you think about history absolutely is. So that's where I'm coming at from that point of view. Question 16 now. I've had a lot of you ask about the process, how I do everything, so I'll just lump it all together for convenience sake. So the way I start out is with a timeline of events I want to cover in the episode, which I then flesh out by reading my secondary or sometimes tertiary sources. So for instance, in the episode I'm working on now, I want to cover the Battle of Vimeiro, Franco-Russian relations in the Conference of Erfurt, and then possibly a little bit of Franco-Austrian relations. We'll see how that goes. But that means I visit the chapters in the books and other sources relevant to those topics. I read up, I make notes, and then I start drafting chapters. So this gives a basic structure for the episode. My general knowledge of the period is good, but I do always go back to read the sources, so I'm not omitting or misrepresenting things. This isn't a very organized process. Like the same document that is the planning document does eventually become the finished script. And so for future, and I don't really reference things, which I didn't do at the start, and I probably should have started doing earlier on, but for future series, I'm 100% going to reference, so I could theoretically release a transcript and you could actually read it more like an essay as opposed to anything I say. But once all that's done, I have a basic draft with no introduction or conclusion, like a skeleton. I also don't have any bridges between the paragraphs. So this is because I've learned doing this for a while that if you have a strict structure, you can end up with some very odd non sequiturs and disconnected concepts if you try and link them up before you're ready for it. So with the structure now, I go to the primary sources, which in my case is mostly letters, memoirs, accounts. Napoleonica and Gallica are my saviors here, and they have such an incredible range of sources. Like, visit them. They're very cool. Pretty much all of them, literally 95% of them are in French, so I translate to the best of my ability. I'll use Google Translate if I don't know a word or a phrase. And then I use the information I get to flesh out the skeleton, put detail into the draft, that sort of thing. It's at this stage that I'm able to revise the initial draft with new insights, new thoughts, more context, because I've been thinking about it for a little. It's probably been at least a couple of days, if not weeks at this stage. So I'm able to have more complex, interesting thoughts about things, so I will definitely revise a lot of what I've already written. And it's also what I hope makes the episodes more interesting than just reading like a Wikipedia article or watching a bare bones YouTube video. It's also definitely my favorite part because when I you get that eureka moment and you can sort of write something and go, that's clever. That's a really good feeling. So this stage I have like a half written episode. It's got no intro, no conclusion, no bridges, but that means I can swap out the chapters as needed. As for the actual ordering of it, I've learned that chronology should not inform or dictate the structures in order for the episodes to be actually watchable. Like that's why, for instance, all of the content on the imperial nobility we did just recently was done in one big lump, as opposed to if I had followed strict chronology, I would have been doing it in small bits for like the last 5 or 6 episodes. That's also why the Austrians have barely been mentioned since like 1805, 1806, because we'll cover Franco-Austrian relations up to 1809 in one big lump so that it's fresh and relevant as we go into the next war between France and Austria. Was it 4th coalition, 5th coalition? I can't remember. Too many coalitions. But I order things by relevance as opposed to strict chronology. Once I'm happy with the episode structure and have written good paragraphs that I like, I make the bridges. Basically, there's a little rhetorical links between the chapters. Sometimes this can be really, really hard, but other times really easy. It varies a lot. Like trying to link the most recent episode, I was trying to link finances into farming, and I think it took me a couple of hours to work out some way to do it. I can't even remember what I did. It probably wasn't very good. I also do a pass for spelling, grammar. The big one is inconsistencies or errors in what I've said. Like I'll occasionally say like, something happened in 1804 when it happened in 1805, that sort of thing. But also inconsistencies between episodes. But that's hard given the time frame for when I write. Like it's sometimes literally months between when I write things and then when it becomes relevant again. So I have to reread previous chapters, reacquaint myself with certain sources sometimes to sort of make sure everything's consistent. I also change sentences because at this stage it's sort of getting towards the finalized draft. I'll change the sentences to match my cadence. And then when I go to record, if I actually find that the sentence doesn't work, I'll usually break it up into smaller parts. But yeah, I record with nothing fancy, just like a USB microphone on my laptop. Put up a couple of mattresses and pillows and things like that. I use Audacity to record. I'll make sure that the gaps between the sentences are ideally about a second long, and I'll also put like a little silence over them so you can't hear me breathing or whatever between them. I take all the finished audio files, I put them in a Sony Vegas, and then start to make an actual episode. I have a hard drive full of French Napoleonic 18th and 19th century paintings, illustrations that I've gathered over the years. Most of them I get from Gallica or Wikimedia Commons. I used to, for some of the earlier episodes, I used to just go on straight Google search and grab some out of desperation. I also used, I think, some Alamy images, like actually paid for them. I would not do that again in a million years. I do really try and find relevant images where I can, but like I am so constrained by what people have actually painted and also what is available. So sometimes I catch a bit of flack for like not putting like a strictly relevant image on. It's so hard. It's so hard sometimes. Like I got one I put on a Swiss grenadier as opposed to like a French one. It's like, use your imagination, because I have to have it be visually consistent more so than be visually accurate, if that makes sense. So if I just like suddenly don't include a French grenadier it was for one of the Grande Armée organization episodes. If I just suddenly have a picture without just words, just description of what French grenadiers are, and there's nothing there for it, it's like, that would look kind of stupid. Finding usable images is very time consuming. For some of the episodes, sometimes it's as easy as just going to Wikimedia and just, you get a battle picture. If it's a battle, there's going to be 1,000 pictures usually. But I want to do a council meeting. I want to do the Continental Blockade. I want to do some like diplomatic summit. There are no bloody paintings half the time. It's really tough. So you kind of I have to struggle a little bit. You have to use your imagination a little bit. No one's happy, but we get by. There's also consistency with the images. Like, it's possible to get an image of like 19th century Paris, but has it got electric street lamps or tugboats, steamboats in the Seine? You have to watch for those sorts of inconsistencies, which would, if you switched on and watching, you're like, oh, that just takes me out. It's like some of the earlier episodes I've definitely got pictures of Paris where you're like, oh, that's like the 1850s, man. Like, you can probably sleuth it out, but yeah, I'm a lot more careful about that now. I also have to make the maps, which they've been through various iterations over the period of the channel. Some of the early ones are terrible now. I would never use them, and I stopped using them when I realized how terrible they were. But map making is very time consuming, and I wouldn't say it's difficult, but yeah, it just takes ages. The base of my European maps are Sayawari's period maps, which I will link in the description, and which you can find in the description for all the episodes, in case you're wondering. So their maps are much more detailed and accurate than the ones I put on the channel. I go for like pop, color, and readability primarily. Anything outside of Europe, I've traced the European maps as well, but anything outside of Europe, as well as traced from whatever other reference map I can find online, and then I will basically just eyeball and guesstimate where borders and things are. I can usually get it pretty accurate, but it's never like 100%. Basically, the same goes for the battle maps. I have to find a reference image somewhere. If I can't find a reference image, I won't do it. But I'm also, for those as well, I'm all about simplicity, readability. Like, I don't need to have every river, every stream, every copse of trees. I don't need every village to be represented accurately. I just need you to know that there's like a village about here. That's fine, With all that, I can start making the actual episode. Battles and map sequences take ages. especially when I have to make all the icons for them as well. But yeah, I don't pretend to be any good at any of the visual stuff. I don't pretend to be good at anything after the reading and writing, really. And it's also just me, so I have to do all the visual stuff, on my own as well. But yeah, then you get basically a finished episode. As for my background, I'm just basically a history lover. I did half a history degree with a mind to become a history teacher, but I didn't finish it and ended up in a very different career anyway. But the specific story about why I started the channel is because I was listening to Mike Duncan's French Revolution series, part of his bigger Revolution series, which I 100% recommend. It is such a good series. But yeah, I just wanted more of the French Revolution. I looked around, couldn't find anything I liked, so I just decided to write my own. And I had been fascinated by the French Revolution and 18th, 19th century history more generally in school, so I had good grounding for it. But yeah, I read as much as I could for a couple months, decided, actually I could probably make an episode out of what I've written, because I'm not just going to regurgitate it. I think I've got interesting things to say. I think I've got at least a more interesting way to say it. So I felt like there was possibly an audience for it, but ultimately I actually made it selfishly for myself. And still to this day, that is kind of like a guiding principle for the channel. I make content that I myself would like, and if other people like it too, excellent. That's good. I like that. But it's ultimately for me, which is kind of selfish. But yeah, we eventually finished the French Revolution. Napoleon's the next logical step. So, and also had really good grounding and again, Napoleonic history as well. But yeah, I hope all that explains why making an episode can take a long while and be pretty arduous. I also work full time while this is all going on. So yeah, it's mostly started off kind of like a hobby, and then it's now become closer to like a part-time job, but it is done in my spare time, basically. To answer Vara AGG's specific question on AI use, I don't use AI personally at all, and I don't think it has any place in my work or on the channel at all. As boomer as this is going to make me sound, very boomer, but I learned history by reading and writing in assignments, listening to the teacher in the classroom, actually doing it myself, and I am better off for it. So whatever time I might save by having AI do something for me is fully offset by the loss of my personal input, my voice, my perspective, and also it's going to compromise my own personal understanding. Like, I theoretically could ask it, can you give me a list of 10 sources for Napoleonic battle tactics? And it would be able to give me 10 sources for Napoleonic battle tactics. But I haven't myself gone and found those sources. I haven't gone and necessarily examined them for usability or readability. It would still behoove me to actually go and read the damn sources and actually still do a lot of the work myself, but I would feel disingenuous doing it. Now, the only time I ever used anything AI adjacent for the channel was I tried to see if it was possible to do image upscaling, where AI image upscaling. It looks crap, so I just never did it after a certain point. And I never included it it was just an experiment. I never put it in a finalized video. For question 17, Mohammed Shabib asks what periods of history I like outside of what's already on the channel. The answer is, I don't discriminate. I have a solid history of pretty much the entire world. Really any time period. I've just read a lot. I'm also your guy for trivia as well. But my main interest has always been European and American modern history. If I were to give specifics, I'd say the 18th, 19th centuries generally are my bread and butter. I was deep into post-war World War I, interwar Europe, post-World War II Europe as well, in uni. South American independence is fascinating. I love the Russian Revolution, English Civil War, 30 Years' War, Protestant Reformation. Theology more generally is actually sort of an interest I have. The revolutions of 1848, and then I did a really, really good course on decolonization in the 1960s, just decolonization in general in the 20th century. Fascinating. As an Australian, I have to be partial to the Pacific War, and like any boy who read a lot of history books, World War II, classic. World War I as well, I don't think you can escape them. Roman Empire. I'm forgetting the Roman Empire. There's a certain curriculum there that I think everybody's familiar with. But I actually don't have, I would literally say my worst history field would have to be Australian history. I know very little about modern Australian history. Like, I literally know more about the history of Canada or Japan or somewhere. Like, give me basically any other major country and I would know more than Australia. Recently, I've been sort of getting into more stuff about the American Civil War. I got a massive campaign map book from my granddad. Like, I think it's drawn up by some sort of official U.S. Army cartography group, and it's just so detailed and incredibly fascinating. But when I read military stuff, I need context. I need the political context. I know the broad strokes of the American Civil War. Getting into the detail now is fascinating. Oh, Roman Republic. I said Roman Empire. I mean Roman Republic, which actually, like, literally the first, like, half of Roman history is actually more interesting to me than the second half, weirdly. Next question by MTK1. They ask, what's next after the Napoleon series? Well, Napoleon will take us past the guy's life and into his legacy and impact, so we'll have to have at least, like, 3 or 4 episodes post-death to go into all those various topics, and that means we'll touch on, probably not cover in any real detail, but at least touch on a lot more 19th century French history. So that would be Bourbon Restoration France, the July Monarchy, the Second French Republic, and then the main thing for Napoleonic legacy is, the Second Empire. As for the next big project, it's the 30 Years' War. So far as I can see, nobody has done the period justice, or at any real scale, certainly on YouTube or even elsewhere. You can get some excellent books, but nothing sort of like pop history, educational sort of consumption media has done the 30 Years' War properly. So I'll be a guy for that one. But the 30 Years' War has long been a fascination of mine, and I just kind of want the excuse to cover it in copious detail. I've already started making maps for it. Like, I can't be stopped at this stage. Doing the 30 Years' War will necessarily have to take us through the Protestant Reformation, and then also earlier Reformation movements. It's a long process, that one. But I've already partially mapped out what the Reformation episodes, the series I should say, is going to look like. And instead of going chronologically, I'm probably going to go region by region. It's going to give us a much better sort of grounding because it is actually quite regionalized, and it also lets me, if I don't go by strict chronology, it means I can do a lot more depth on specific regions. So like obviously I'd have to treat like Hungary as it's Hungary, not just modern Hungary, but like the whole sort of like, so like North Balkans, that sort of area as its own sort of separate entity. And I can go into like Transylvania is going to be massive for the 30 Years' War. So like going into the religious depth of that region specifically is going to be really useful. It means you're going to get Hussitism, for instance, which a strict chronological history of the Protestant Reformation wouldn't give you. You'd have to sort of link back to it, and it's not going to be very useful. But yeah, all that said, that's all years in the future. So I don't want to be too hasty and choose like another project. Like this is literally the next few years of my life doing this, at least. But I have half a mind to do a series on interwar Europe sometime in the future. That'd be a lot of fun. And I do also want to revisit, and probably not as part of a main series, but like just here and there, revisit the French Revolution at some point. All right, and final question, Rob asks, do you agree that Leclerc is the only driver talent-wise that's close to Verstappen on the grid, followed closely by Russell, I guess? Yes, the general consensus is that Leclerc is talent-wise the only driver who is anything like Verstappen-esque. Leclerc is at serious risk of being one of many drivers who definitely deserves a world championship. They have the talent. At times they've had the car. At times they've had the team. I think Leclerc's, like, the talent's been consistent. He just either hasn't had the car or hasn't had the team behind him. Like, it was started with Sauber, went on to Ferrari famously. So he's never had the sort of support that he needs to win a world championship. Max obviously has, but he definitely has the talent. That's consistent. George is massively underrated. I was saying this like back in like 23. Like, he was a stroppy shit. Nobody liked him, but he was still a pretty good stick. So he's projected to win this year. Mostly people are putting it down to the Mercedes power unit, but his performance last year was excellent. I'm going to have a look now, actually. How many races did he win? Okay, so he only won 2. He won Canada and Singapore, but he had plenty of podiums. And definitely, I mean, how much you would attribute that to his raw skill as opposed to the Mercedes team performing quite well last year. I don't know, that's debatable. If you want to talk about talent more as well, Isaac Hadjar, I watched him through the junior series and he was electric at times. Like the troughs were low, but the highs were really high. So he's when he spun out on the reconnaissance lap or formation lap, whatever it was, last year at Australia, I was like, ooh, Jesus, was my faith justified? But no, he had an excellent year last year, and he's in the Red Bull this year, obviously, so he very easily could be a world champion in future. He's definitely got some of that raw kick, that raw talent that people talk about with Verstappen. But I don't know what his relationship with his father. So does he have the drive? Who knows? All right, and with all that, we're done. So thank you for listening. If your question wasn't in this episode, I'll almost certainly do it in another one coming up. I've collated all the questions, so they're all good questions too. They're all interesting ones. I just wanted to answer sort of a wider range of ones for the first episode to just sort of give a taste of all the types of questions we'll get. But yeah, back to work on the next episode now, and see you then.